Hello, everybody, and welcome back to video 23 in this series. I'm preparing lecture notes for a summer camp with high schoolers and decided that instead of uh, ma making a video, editing my notes based on how it went in the video, and then deleting the videos, I'd share the videos online in case other people are interested in the stuff here. So we're up to video 23. We've done quite a bit, set up a landscape, and then created a character, got the character moving around, and a whole bunch of other things along the way. But now we're into why is our character moving? The storytelling aspect of the video game. And this is part two on storytelling, so just a continuation from the previous one. And let's just jump right into the storytelling aspects then. So next up is something that in the previous video I mentioned creative writing courses. Uh, This is the stuff you would study there. So the components of storytelling. First up is one everybody probably knows the name of, the plot. So this is the main events, um, the primary conflict, what's going wrong that caused this story to happen and be interesting. Because stories about good times usually aren't so interesting. So we want some conflict going on. Uh, Actually, I should put the words the rising. How does it escalate? How do we get from the introduction to the climax? That general flow of the story across those three acts, like we talked about in the previous one. How do we start with that nice little introduction and build up to the climax of the story? So, something about plot is the first thing that you'll want to think about when what is the overall driving force of the story. And as far as the plot goes, there's not much difference between traditional storytelling and uh, game development storytelling. And just like in traditional storytelling, there is a big cautionary thing we want to avoid. So avoid this happened, and I'm going to abbreviate here. So this happened, then this happened, then this, and that whole sequential telling of a story. Um, right? This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and we could add in details from just about any story and making it sequential. Uh, kind of the story gets boring and predictable before long. How do you balance that out? Let me put that maybe in green. Um, how do we avoid that and get to a nice balance? If I can spell the word balance correctly. Sorry about the messy handwriting there. How do we get to a balance there? Think about ebb and flow. So this happened. Then we do a sidestep and some other things happen. Then we come back and this happened. So open world games are a great example of that. We go through uh, the first action mission or whatever it's called for the particular game, and then we go do some stuff in the open world, randomly run around, different uh, buy different uh, inventory items that'll help us along the way, and then we come back and do the second mission, and we break it up, that ebb and flow to the story. So keep that in mind. And so the plot is basically the main events, the rising leading into the climax, and then the fall. Those are very specific things that have been detailed as far as storytelling um, in the thousands of years humans have been studying this. So we don't want to disregard that knowledge, because as far as like telling a story, writing it in English, and telling a story through game development, there's very little difference in our plot. Some of the other components are going to be quite different, and game developers usually have advantage on the other components. So let's look at some other ones. So the next major component, I guess, would be the narration. How it's told, which to lead into game development, let me add a second label for this, the point of view. Uh, this one's very obvious in game development. What's the point of view of the gamer? Is it a first person game, a third person game? Uh, how are we telling the story? I'm going to grab the green marker and put obvious in game. So it's very straightforward for game development. It's often directly related to how we position our camera. But the way we tell the story, the narration, the manner in which we tell our story will have a major effect on how that story is perceived. So we want to at least keep those things in mind. But that one's very straightforward, and instead of the descriptiveness that we would have in a traditional written story, the narration and point of view mostly comes about by the position, how we position our camera, which, as you're well aware of in game dev, we haven't done it in this tutorial series, but that's something we can give the player control over. We can switch between first person and third person views. Racing games are a good example of that. After narration, the point of view of our game, what's the mood of our game or story? Is it dark, light, serious, funny? Um, this list could go on for quite some time, but what's the mood? And as far as this, there is a big advantage to game dev. Advantage to game dev over traditional storytelling. Let's take the traditional example, the English teachers, the stereotyped example the English teachers would go on about with like blue curtains. The author writes about blue curtains, maybe a little tattered or something, and that is said to imply depression. But for game developers, we don't have to write about a bunch of adjectives and stuff trying to describe tattered blue curtains blowing in a breeze. We can actually draw the curtains hanging by that window that are in rough shape, and we have the window there, and we can actually draw our blue curtains and show them on a dark night with poor lighting and maybe a bunch of fog in the room, and really get that in. So for mood, a very important one in traditional storytelling, but game developers have a huge advantage with that because we're actually drawing the stuff, not just describing it. The next couple on the list are very straightforward things in game development. So I'm just going to list them out here, but traditional storytelling elements, so characters. Oh, meant to have the black pen on. So the characters, and who are our main characters? What characters drive the story? Our characters and our NPCs. What's the interaction between our characters, the NPCs, the mobs, and all the other stuff in the game? Which also gets into dialogue, which I'm I'm going to put an asterisk here because there's lots of ways we can handle dialogue in game development. Sometimes traditional written one, the choices along the way. Uh, it follows suit from the traditional ones. What do the characters have to say to each other? Uh, and how do they interact? What's their uh, are they just polite to each other? Are they rude to each other? Are the characters old friends, new acquaintances? It does a lot of work in the story, especially for character development and revealing steps. So I'll put that. Use the dialogue to reveal story components. So instead of directly describing it, sneak it in through the dialogue. A subtlety that they might not pick up on the first time the player gets to that scene in the game. That can make a big difference. Next up is setting. I'll switch back to the blue color. Um, Hopefully that one's as trivial as characters there. Uh, where and when does it take place? How does the time, place, and the scenery affect what the characters are doing? Um, our game is over in a big open landscape, sort of mountainy or hilly scene. How would the character behave differently if it was in a cityscape with generally the same plot? So you want to take these things into consideration. Um, Probably avoid anachronisms unless you are specifically looking for comedic effect. But comedic effect might be the goal you're going for in the game. So you want to keep that in mind. So those three are very straightforward. Not much difference between the traditional storytelling versions of characters, dialogue, and setting. What would be different is that we're doing it in a game dev instead of writing up words in a novel. And the last three major components of tradition, as traditional storytelling is taught, um, are very, very important in game dev. So symbols, whoops, let me undo that. Write the correct word here. Symbols or symbolism. Um, what do they represent? How can you strategically place them? I'll add these words in. Represent, strategically place. So that the character will see them at the right time. Hints on what they need to do. If the character gets lost, symbolism is a good way to bring them back on track with the story. Uh, and move story to climax. How do we use symbolism to keep the story moving along? And along with the symbolisms, how do they tie into the theme? Which often will have more than one. The theme or the themes of the game, the subject or idea that weaves itself in, uh, holds the story together. The point of the plot, I guess, is one way to say it. Point of the plot. So, what are some traditional examples in game dev, especially the traditional one of good versus evil? Um, Curiosity, Unrequited Love is probably more popular in traditional storytelling. I'm not sure of too many games that follow that suit, but there probably are some. Uh, Relationships, and that general, uh, those themes and concepts that bind humanity together. Which one of those are you applying in your story? And how is it the point of the plot? It kind of helps hold the whole story together. And finally, the last of the major components you would study about storytelling in a creative writing class is the audience. Who's the story for? And how does that question impact the other components? Um, that is going to be a very, very unique question to your game. Very, very unique thing to study. But a quick example to try to generalize an example is we could make we could have the same general plot, uh, point of view, mood for the game, uh, characters, dialogue, setting, all of that, the same general, a lot of the same general things as the as a horror game or as a game teaching children to learn their alphabet. But you would approach those things very, very differently in those two games, right? Your That would drastically change your mood or your setting. For the mood, right? The horror game is going to be um, uh, dark and a little creepy, something like probably the dragging sort of soundtrack that builds suspension. Whereas in the uh, teach children to learn their alphabet game, it's going to be brightly colored and bouncy and all of that stuff. Even if we give the characters the same names and put them through the same series of events and do it from the same view, there's going to be the components are going to be approached very, very differently. And that is a very unique question for your game. So the traditional components of storytelling, the plot, the point of view, the mood, the characters, the dialogue, the setting, the symbolism, the themes, and the audience. We always want to think about those things as we start putting our game together, and they make a big difference on the final result of the game. So, uh, just some quick notes about storytelling, mostly in here just to make sure you're aware that that is a critical component. It often gets omitted in the tutorials we would find on like YouTube where these videos are going because those are just tutorials. They just show you how to do a step in the game engine, not necessarily the overall picture of game development. But there are no shortage of creative writing courses um, in formal settings like community colleges or in informal settings like a night class at the community center. And that latter one is usually free if you live in a city where there are community centers that do things in the evenings. So if you're serious about game development, you probably want to look into make sure you take a creative writing course, not just the math courses and physics courses and all that other stuff and art courses that we immediately think of with game development. Because what are we doing with those things? How do we tie them together? That's storytelling is one of the most important aspects of game development because that's really what we're doing with a game is telling a story. All right, and I will see you in the next video when we'll be back to actively developing our game instead of just the conceptual things. But don't forget about storytelling. It's one of the most important things. Oh, maybe one more video about storytelling. It'll come later this evening if I make, and then we'll be back to the game dev stuff. See you then.